So far this semester, we covered a number of moral philosophies, right? It's a natural question to ask, can these be reconciled in any way? Or to ask questions like, what would a satisfactory moral theory look like, since we've covered a good number of the most plausible ones that we have, and they still, have some issues, even though we just got an introductory look at those issues. So just real quickly, consider all the different kinds of moral considerations that we have looked at this semester. At the very beginning of this semester, in the first reading assignment from the Wolf's portion of that first reading assignment, he mentions that the goal of studying moral philosophy is to get a better understanding of the sorts of considerations that go into moral thinking more generally, right? So that's a pretty modest goal of that. But we will look at an attempt to try to reconcile some of these. First, a simple one, and then I'll mention some other things that have gone on in more recent philosophy that you might be interested in, or reading about, or looking about. It's like if we were going to start the second stage of the class, that's where we would start it, basically, right? So think about the different theories that we covered this semester. We looked at some meta-ethic debates between the moral rationalist side, or the moral realist side of things, and the anti-realists. And then we looked at a series of normative moral theories and then some alternative views. And when it came to just those traditional normative theories, we looked at ethical egoism. So again, all these normative theories are theories that are trying to provide us a standard for distinguishing what's permissible, impermissible, and what's obligatory, or distinguish between virtues and vices, right? So ethical egoism said it was rational, enlightened self-interest. Contractarianism said it was the agreements between self-interested rational agents. We looked at universalizability arguments, a couple of different types of those. One of them was from Kant, where the key issues were maxims, motives, and intentions. And then with another kind of universalizability argument, it was a utilitarian version of that. So there the consequences, not the intentions, motives, and maxims, were most important. We looked at virtue. Many of these theories were teleological, meaning that the goal is that right action or good character produces some kind of outcome, or helps promote an outcome, whether it's peace and social order, or human flourishing, or maximizing overall happiness, right? And maybe what's important is the character traits of the persons who are performing these actions rather than the actions themselves. So it was virtue ethics. Then we looked at some alternative theories, beginning with care ethics. We looked at a theory of corrective justice. And then we looked at two existentialist views, one of which emphasized authenticity, whereas the other one emphasized responsibility for and to the other. So it's just a natural question to ask, can these be integrated in a coherent way? If there was an easy answer to that, I would have only taught one theory, right? So unlike biology, where you go over, physics is a little bit different, but in biology, they're pretty much settled on one theory being the best explanation that we have so far, and then running around trying to fill in the gaps of that theory, or pursuing lines of research opened up by that theory. So, if you were studying biology in the 17th or 18th century, it would be different. There would be competing models of evolution that were being debated, but the scientists have settled on one. But we don't get that in moral theory. But obviously, most of these theories have something going for them. But the problem seems to be trying to develop a theory around just one single intuition or normative standard. So, could we practically integrate them? Or what would a satisfactory moral theory look like? So I assigned this article for today by James Rachels. The title of the article is "What Would a Satisfactory Moral Theory Look Like?" And so I thought we'd just wrap up the semester by taking a look at his answer of that, and then pointing you in the direction of a couple of other recent attempts to answer that question. So he says the way to try to do that is to begin with a modest conception of human beings. So he says, we have evolved as social creatures, living together in groups, wanting one another's company, needing one another's cooperation, and capable of caring about one another's welfare. So there's pleasing theoretical fit between what reason requires of us, namely impartiality, which has been in the background, if not explicit, in every one of our theories, or at least most of them. B, the requirements of social living, namely adherence to a set of rules or conventions that, if fairly applied, would serve everyone's interests. And then C, our natural inclination to care about others, at least to a modest degree, but particularly those who are our friends and family, right? Members of our community. All three work together, he says, to make morality not only possible, but in an important sense natural for us. So he's making the point that morality is not like this added thing to human nature, but is a part of our natural existence. So it's not like something that we have to work ourselves into. It's something that we are all already doing. The question is then is it coherent, or could it be made coherent? So that's where reason is going to come in, obviously. So he says, because we're rational and we're able to take some facts as reasons for behaving one way rather than another, we articulate those reasons, we think about them, you weight them differently and abandon some and adopt others. Thus, we take the fact that an action would help satisfy our desires, needs, and so, in short, the fact of an action would promote our interests as a reason in favor of doing that thing. So we're, just like we started at the beginning of the semester, we're reasoning animals, and even when we're doing it, most of the time we're doing it implicitly. Like when we do philosophy, you try to make that more explicit. So his first principle, promote everyone's interest equally. You might remember, and should remember, from earlier in the semester when we looked at moral relativism, Rachel's offered this standard. He said, so against the cultural and moral relativist, he was arguing the fact that this standard might be reasonably used in thinking about any social practice whatever. We may ask whether that practice promotes or hinders the welfare of the peoples whose lives are affected by it. So we can start there again, and he's going to add something to that basic principle, of course. So, treating everyone's interests alike in that regard. And then treating people as they deserve. So promoting everyone's interest equally, and then treating people as they deserve. He wants to reconcile those two things. So he says the idea that people should be treated as they deserve is connected with the idea that they are rational agents with power over their choices, right? So if people were not rational and had no control over their actions, they would not be responsible for their conduct, and they could not deserve good or on account of it. Rational beings, however, are responsible for what they freely choose to do, and those who choose to behave decently towards others deserve to be treated well in return, while those who treat others badly deserve to be treated badly in return. So notice they're starting to develop an account of how we can justify differential treatment when it needs to occur. We also need to include in the moral life other moral motives, things that are not often thought of as moral motives, particularly from our kind of modern moral theory perspective, like deontology and utilitarianism, which kind of stripped interpersonal relations out. We're just supposed to be behind the veil of ignorance, right? And calculating units of utility without regard to whose utility it is, right? So he says, look, we need to include these other things as moral motives, including love, loyalty, friendship, etc. They are motives that, from a moral point of view, we should not want to eliminate from human life. The desire to create, pride in doing one's job well, the other such motives which contribute to personal happiness and to the general welfare. So we got to include both of those things, not just my happiness, but the general welfare as well. Notice he was very skeptical of egoism because it disregarded the welfare of others and put more emphasis on one's own welfare than others. And decided that was an arbitrariness problem, right? So we should no more want to eliminate them than we would want to eliminate love and friendship. Our lives, including our moral lives, would be pretty lost without those things. So we need to include those. So his solution is a multiple strategies utilitarianism, which allows for personal different ways of maximizing overall utility, which was not a part of more traditional looking versions of that theory. So the most plausible view might be called multiple strategies utilitarianism. Here's why it's utilitarian. The end is the general welfare, right? But diverse strategies may be endorsed as means of achieving that end. Right? So in other words, we don't all have to pursue the same precise actions all the time. There can be different, we don't have to act like automatons here. So he says sometimes we aim directly at it when, as a legislator enacts a law for general welfare, or when an individual calculates that sending money to UNICEF would do more good than anything else available to them. But sometimes we don't think of it at all. Instead, we simply care for our children, work at our jobs, obey the law, and so forth. Those should be included, right? Even when we're doing those things just kind of routinely. So we could come up with an optimum list of the kind of characteristics that a life would need to have, both to promote the welfare of oneself and the welfare of others equally. And again, he's working with these two principles. Promote everyone's interests equally, which we saw in his older formulation, as well as treating people as they deserve. So he says, suppose we had a fully specified list of the virtues, motives, and methods of decision-making that would characterize a person whose life is both satisfying to himself or herself and contributes positively to the welfare of others. That list would include at least the following: the virtues that are needed to make one's life go well. So that includes, things like courage, patience, diligence, those sorts of things. A sensitivity to reason giving, right? The motives to act on which one will act, are they other regarding motives or selfish motives, for example? Are they motives that emphasize the welfare of others to the exclusion of myself? That wouldn't fit well in Rachel's version of utilitarianism, right? So with the other versions of it might require me to sacrifice myself when I don't want to, right? But Rachel's model wouldn't necessarily draw that conclusion. So commitments to those personal relationships. So there we're including some elements from care ethics that they emphasized, right? As opposed to abstract social relationships, these interpersonal relationships are central to the moral life. The duties and concerns associated with the projects that one will undertake, whether that's a particular job or being a student or playing on a sports team or working in a neighborhood garden. The everyday rules that one will follow, most of the time without thinking. You still need to reflect on those. And then a strategy or set of strategies for determining when exceptions should be made and on what grounds exceptions should be made. So notice he's basing that again on this fundamental idea that we're in control of ourselves, at least in some degree, right? So right conduct on this view would be following the best plan for promoting everyone's welfare equally, treating people as they deserved, right? And that's going to be a different plan for many of us. There'll be similarities. They won't all be radically different from one another or all unique, but they will have different plans, right? Each of you pick different majors, but most of those majors are going to involve working with other people and contributing to society in some way, right? Whether it's building bridges or computer programs. So he says, at any rate, there's some combination of virtues, motives, and methods of decision-making that is the best for me given my circumstances, personality, and talents. Best in this sense that it will optimize my chances of my having a good life while at the same time optimizing the chances of other people having good ones as well. Remember, we are trying to promote the interest of others equally. So call this optimum combination the best plan. The right thing for me to do is to act in accordance with that best plan. So there could be variations within that. Different people have different plans, but obviously they're going to have those common features in mind. So the next thing he moves to is expanding the moral community beyond, one's own family or one's own identity group. So moral personhood, which is an issue that popped up a lot this semester. We looked at two main criteria for it: rational agency and sentience. both of those we saw had kind of a dark underbelly, especially rationality, where, you know, that means that mentally disabled people aren't fully members of the moral community. Most of us would probably have a bit of a problem with that, at least to the point of like thinking that, well, you can't just go around smacking mentally disabled people for fun, right? So moral personhood or consideration needs to be expanded. It should include, it should not be specific to location, place, and time. It should also, if we're promoting everyone's interest equally, then I need to have in my plan something that's going to help promote the interest of people on the other side of the world as well, or at least not disregard them. And to include not only the environment, but non-human animal welfare also. So there we're not dealing just with rational agents or sentient beings. We're also worried about non-human life, which sometimes that's hard to see whether it's sentient or not. Although there's weird things that go on with some plants in that regard. The way they respond to their environment. So does that mean something's going on in there we're unaware of, right? So and just as a general point, where we draw that moral personhood line, that tends to be where there's some moral hazard involved, right? So this is going to obviously include justice and fairness, although he's tried to expand it beyond those, beyond a myopic focus on just those, right? That's why we got to have those other moral motives motives would be included as a part of morality. So utilitarianism he's got to work against this problem. Utilitarianism, if he's going to develop this multi-strategies version of it, he's got to deal with the fact that utilitarianism is often criticized for disregarding justice or promoting immoral means because the ends justify them. So we've looked at a punishment example on that. Compensation for work examples have popped up, particularly the punishment example. Like the angry mob would be settled if we just get rid of this one guy that they all falsely believe is guilty. But on a utilitarian scale, it looks like that's what you ought to do, right? So he says in response to that, insofar as justice is concerned, a person's voluntary actions can justify departures from our basic policy of equal treatment, but nothing else can. So voluntary actions can justify differential treatment. I'll give you a mundane example from Monday. All my classes had an exam on Tuesday, and I had a couple of people that weren't there in almost all of my sections on Tuesday and emailed me after the exam and said, well, I went home. Can I make up the exam? Now, were they free to contact me to take that exam early in accordance with our makeup policies? They sure were. In fact, many people did so. Did they not, Cade? They did. And so that was his voluntary action. He should have known better. He should have known what the policy was, known that that's not an excused absence, and made arrangements to take care of it earlier. So there were some people that got zeros across all of my classes because of that. It sucks. I feel bad for doing it, but I don't get to just call up work and say, hey, I didn't lecture today. Can I make that up the next time, right? That's our voluntary actions, not taking care of business, right? So just think of it. Normally, we all get the right of free movement unless you murder somebody and are found guilty, and then we restrict that again. So long as you weren't being controlled by someone else when you did that murder, you're responsible for that and can be justified differently, right? Different treatment can be justified there. So an outline of a satisfactory moral theory would have those elements. However, he says it's instructive to remember that many great thinkers have tried to devise such a theory, and history has judged them to have not only been partially successful. If we were to read most of the works that we read excerpts from, or not even excerpts from, but like if we read the actual articles, most of those books are those thinkers trying to engage those other issues and going against those other theories, right? So they all fell up short of that, even though each one has something plausible about it. We wouldn't still be studying it if they didn't have something plausible about them. So that suggests it would be wise not to make too grandiose a claim. Epistemic humility here for one's preferred view, but you need to be able to have good arguments to support it. Its reasonableness, if not supporting its truth. Right? Then he mentions Derek Parfit here, who I'll come back to, who's another contemporary philosopher that did a lot of work on this point. So he said, as Derek Parfit observed, the earth will remain habitable for another billion years, maybe. and civilization is only now a few thousand years old. So if we don't destroy ourselves, moral philosophy may be making more progress later. Right? So be tentative with our conclusions. As good as a general policy. So his multiple strategies, utilitarianism, modest conception of rational human beings, right conduct is following the life's best plan for oneself, but that's going to include both promoting everyone's interests equally, including one's own, having to justify differential treatment, and those other motives being included in the moral life, and then a modest conclusion that's open to revision. Right? And then I'll just point you in the direction of a couple of other attempts at trying to reconcile moral philosophies. One more recent attempt from 2005. I know 20 years ago sounds old to y'all, but not to me. In philosophy scheme of things, it's still pretty new. So James Sturba wrote a book called The Triumph of Practice Over Theory in Ethics. So you'd be in a good position after this class to read that book, because it goes through several different moral theories and tries to show how, at least in practice, there's much more convergence between them than there is theoretically. Right? So I think I mentioned this before. What philosophers are mostly arguing about is how to justify the theories, not necessarily practical conclusions. For example, yeah, there's some disagreement about promise keeping, but most of the philosophers agree that, yeah, promise keeping is an important moral norm, but then they disagree about how to justify that. Utility versus, categorical imperative kind of thing. So he tries to show that in practice, these things converge a lot more than we often think they do. And then, as I just mentioned, Derek Parfit, 2011. There's a third volume of this too. Volumes 1 and 2. I think volume 2 is just like, maybe 2 and 3 are just responses to critics. And it's multiple. The first volume is like that thick and like that tall. It's no joke of a book. It's hundreds of pages long, and thousands for the whole thing. And he tries to go through what he thinks of as the most plausible challenges to objectivism and universality, tries to defeat those, and then tries to go on trying to reconcile 3 of the basic theories that we looked at. And so he comes up with his triple theory, where he tries to synthesize the best insights from a form of rule utilitarianism, deontology, and contractualism. In the book, the original title of the book that went around the internet for a little while was called Climbing the Mountain, I believe. And the metaphor he uses to try to get at this is that we got a mountain, and all these theories are climbing the same mountain from different sides. Right? So he comes up with this convergence principle, or triple theory. And again, think about the theories we've covered. This should evoke some ideas that we've covered to you, that we've covered in class to you. So he says an act is wrong. Notice he starts out with the wrongness, not rightness. So that's one thing there. An act is wrong just when such acts are disallowed by some principles that are optimific. That means principles that would make things go best, utilitarian rules. You just got to figure out what those rules are. When it's uniquely universalizably willable, so when it violates the categorical imperative, the universalizability test, and it's not reasonably rejectable. So there's his 3 criteria. And then goes about doing, he kind of does some of the basic stuff with promise keeping and truth telling based on that theory. This is his convergence argument, but I won't go through that. The main thing is just his version of the triple theory to worry about. So that's in a book called On What Matters by Derek Parfit. You wouldn't have to read the whole thing. You can read it. It's so big, it's like multiple books in one, so you can actually kind of split it up in different ways for different things. So that's an attempt, or a couple of different attempts, trying to talk about what a satisfactory moral theory would look like. What would that entail, right? What kinds of considerations would that entail?